And
Oh,
you
and
have just
I
pinned.
keep forgetting. Yes, I
You,
keep forgetting to pin. Oh,
yeah.
here. Now I'm pinned. All right. Yeah, the last two or three, I forgot to pin them.
Yes, I was going to remind you today to make sure.
I know. Anyway,
That's okay.
I'm only half here sometimes.
No, no, we all
Oh, we're reading the gospel. I forgot.
Yes, yes, we're going to start reading the gospel together. The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. There's a couple of reasons for it. Someone made a great point this week. They say that I seem to study everything except for the order's works. And
Mhm.
when I thought about it and realized that lately that's been true, I suddenly felt a deep sorrow inside because actually some of the best things that I know, some of the happiest pieces of information I've ever gotten, have come from the works of Ramakrishna and his disciples, and they are directly to blame for all of the ideas that spin around in this head.
Mhm.
And so I thought, as I looked at the layout of things, so on Monday we've got the art and spirit, and that's just for more of a secular approach. Tuesday night, I thought we'd stick with the Vedanta classics. So we'll do the gospel and then other books like the Spiritual Talks and Eternal Companion and whatnot. And then Thursday morning, we have the Vedic Christianity for that kind of approach. Oh, no, that's Friday, that's Thursday night. And then Thursday morning is the more the Jnana Yoga, right now, a Buddhist text, but we'll go for Jnana Yoga on Thursday mornings. So that way we kind of cover everything. There's a lot of bhakti in the Vedic Christian class, a lot of jnana in the Buddhist class. There'll be both. There'll be everything in the gospel class here or this class on Tuesday nights. And then Mondays, wherever the conversation takes us, what have we talked about? That's kind of more of a, I
Mhm.
don't know, conversing class.
Mhm.
So I just kind of want to set the tone. Most of us have are at least familiar with the gospel, obviously. Uh, but there's quite a few things that are quite startling about it to me, when I think about it. As we begin to read it, we have to understand, of course, that at the time it was written, there really was no Ramakrishna, there was no Vivekananda, there was no Holy Mother. They were just normal folk, country folk living very simple lives. And to go and hear them, you weren't going to hear somebody of the caliber that we know them to be these days. You were going to see just somebody at the temple, and that has always been amazing to me in the fact that quite often I've lamented the fact that I didn't get to be there, or I assume that we weren't there. Who knows? That's kind of an exercise. I think I mentioned that once before. Swami Prabhupada, right after I joined the monastery, I was reading the gospel, and at lunch I was telling him something about something that I had read, and he said, "Oh, did you find yourself in there?" And
Mhm.
it kind of caught me and took me back for a minute. I said, "What are you talking about, Maharaj? Well, find myself in there?" He says, "Yes, don't you think you must have been there somewhere? Otherwise, why would you be here?" And
Mhm.
just as a fun, I guess, mind virus that was for me, I've never stopped thinking about that. And when I read the gospel, I try and keep my eye open for someone who I think might have been myself. I think I was probably one of those folks that didn't come into the room, kind of stood back by the door and peeked in here and there. But anyway, it adds a life to it to think that way as you're reading it. Look for it, look to it yourself. Also, to know that I consider this book a direct communication with Sri Ramakrishna. Every time I read it, Ramakrishna becomes more personal and the lessons go deeper for me. I haven't found a bottom to this book every time I open it or anytime I reread a passage for a lecture or something. Always there's more there, always a deeper insight. And the real value to this book for me is that in reading this book, you see a practical example of all the scriptures, all of the Vedas. When you read the Upanishads or even some of the original Vedas, sometimes they're quite philosophical, quite difficult to really nail down what they mean or exactly what they're talking about. And I have found that after I became a student of this book, of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, that it became much more easy. It became easier to understand the scriptures themselves when I approached them. I appreciate in Ramakrishna the fact that even though he was so simple, so we talk about him as being uneducated, but he was anything but uneducated. He was just not traditionally educated. And the amount of knowledge and the simple expositions that he gives, the simple examples, and just the way that he lived. When you read some of the deeper philosophical scriptures, you'll read a truth in there, and Ramakrishna will automatically come to your mind, and you'll remember something he did or something that he said or the way that he was that helps you to understand what that scripture is getting at. It's just delightful to know that Ramakrishna would have been or is, in a sense, such a fun person to hang around with. As we read this book, pay attention to how many times we hear about everybody laughing in the room. Just the joy of spiritual life is so wonderfully alive with Ramakrishna. And you just think in that room, just the life that was in there, to hear these truths and to know that you're there sitting with the one, who, well, I was going to say something, I guess that's only personally true, but someone that you believe will be there in the end for you, someone that will be your only familiarity in a new place at some point. And just the beauty of it, the way how careful he is in the way he speaks to people, how loving he is, and how utterly unreligious he is, how unjudgmental he is, how kind. And so this is to me the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. So I thought we would just jump in and continue doing this until we get through it. So we'll be doing it for a while, but not to get discouraged, because it will touch upon everything, and it will answer questions you didn't know that you had, and it will cover all the gamut. It'll cover the devotional aspects of spiritual life. It'll cover the Advaitic aspects. It'll cover the deeper philosophical underpinnings and metaphysics, which is something beautifully important, because Ramakrishna was very, very much about, of course, renunciation, dispassion, love for God, a longing for truth, and being very serious and being very sober about our spiritual life. And at the same time, he was a child of the Divine Mother, so he danced in ecstasy. He became so intoxicated in love, that his that his clothes would fall off, and he wouldn't even notice, and much less care, And so these non-traditional ways of teaching, I've heard from some of the Swamis that have read the Bengali version, and many of you may have read the Bengali version, to know that he had quite a mouth on him even at times. That he said, to keep the young men coming, he had to give them their fish soup every now and then. So he has some rather, what should you say, earthy ways of talking about things. And in the great master, you see some of the more untraditional practices that he did, living like a monkey as he worshipped God through Rama, dressing in drag for months, many months at a time, as he worshipped God as his handmaiden. He was so good at dressing in drag or dressing as a woman that he could fool even intimate family members into thinking that and not recognizing him as a woman. So he's a very, very unique character, and certainly someone who is very intimate with everyone, because he is our everyone. He is our highest ideal. And of course, the Divine Mother being there playing that backup role very humbly, very sweetly, brings in another beautiful aspect of the divine. And then later on, as Vivekananda begins to develop, He brings in that kingly, very regal and noble sense to the divine. So I've always considered the incarnation, Ramakrishna, as an incarnation, that he's only the head of it, that actually God manifested in three this time, in Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, and Vivekananda, because they are three complete aspects. And of course, God manifest is too much for a single person. So it only makes sense when you look through history and see that God comes as Buddha and provides in that person enough inspiration, depth, religion, renunciation, and knowledge for an entire religion to sprout out on its own. That when he came as Rama, when he came as Chaitanya, when he comes as Jesus, that each time, even in that limited condition, in that limited tool of a body mind that he inhabits, that the divine is able to fill the world with a philosophy and a way of life and an understanding and a deeper plumbing of truth, that each time, a new religion or a new ideal is born. And this time he came, in my mind, as three, and just provided such a beautiful wholeness to our approach to God, to the divine, that this time he came for everyone in a way that is reachable and understandable by everyone, whether they were men, whether they were women, regardless of their nationality, regardless of any of their orientations or conditions of mind. Thakur always had a way for everyone to go forward. And so I'm very excited about reading this text and treat it with a great deal of honor and a great deal of mysticism. Even to open it, I think, is a holy act. And to step in there and allow the divine to talk freshly to you, newly to you. And I say that because I know this is a book that all of us have read. Some of us have read many times. But it is true what Nisargadatta says, that every time you open a scripture, it's the first time. And to be careful to read it that way so that we don't assume something and miss something else that might be very important. So chapter 1, Master and Disciple. It's March 1882. So coming up on, spring in much of the world. In Bengal, this is kind of the last cool month of winter. We're stepping quickly into the summer heat, or the heat of West Bengal here. It was on a Sunday in spring, a few days after Sri Ramakrishna's birthday, that M met him for the first time. Sri Ramakrishna lived in Kalibari, the temple garden of Mother Kali, on the banks of the Ganges at Dakshineshwar. M, being at leisure on Sundays, had gone with his friend Sidhu to several gardens in Baranagar. As they were walking in Prasanna Banerjee's garden, Sidhu said, "There's a charming place on the bank of the Ganges where a Paramahamsa lives. Should you like to go there?" M assented, and they started immediately for Dakshineshwar, to the temple garden. They arrived at the main gate at dusk and went straight to Sri Ramakrishna's room, and there they found him, seated on a wooden couch, facing the east. With a smile on his face, he was talking of God. The room was full of people, everyone seated on the floor, drinking in his words in a deep silence. M stood there speechless, looked on. It was as if he was standing where all the holy places met, as if Sukadeva himself were speaking the words of God, or as if Sri Chaitanya were singing the name and the glories of the Lord in Puri with Ramananda, Swarup, and the other devotees. Sri Ramakrishna said, "When hearing the name of Hari or Rama once, you shed tears and your hair stands on end, then you may know for certain that you do not have to perform such devotion as the Sandhya anymore. Then only will you have a right to renounce rituals, or rather, rituals will drop away of themselves. Then it will be enough if you repeat only the name of Rama or Hari, or even simply Om. Continuing, he said, the Sandhya merges in the Gayatri, and the Gayatri merges in Om. So this stepping down of that spiritual truth, that spiritual divinity. And he says, that when that day comes, that you say the name of God just once and have the hairs on your arms stand up, you get that shiver, that chill that goes through the body as you understand. And why would he tell a room full of devotees that if it wasn't inevitable that at some point you will know, at some point you'll have this experience? And the rituals, the practices, the work, quote, of your practice will fall away into relationship, into a one-on-one walk with God in that level of awareness, where just his name, just that thought, or just seeing someone that reminds you of him or something that reminds you of her, that divinity, and your hair stands on end. M looked around him with wonder, indeed, and said to himself, what a beautiful place. What a charming man. How beautiful his words are. I have no wish to move from this spot. After a few minutes, he thought, let me see the place first, and then I'll come back and sit down. As he left the room with Sidhu, he heard the sweet music of the evening service rising in the temple from the gong, the bell, the drum, and the cymbal. He could hear music from the Nahabat, too, at the south end of the garden. The sounds traveled over the Ganges, floating away and losing themselves in the distance. A soft spring wind was blowing, laden with the fragrance of flowers. The moon just appeared. It is as if nature and man together were preparing for the evening worship. And indeed it was. M and Sidhu visited the 12 Shiva temples, the Radhikanta temple, and the temple of Bhavatarini. And as M watched the services before the images, his heart was filled with joy. On the way back to Sri Ramakrishna's room, the two friends talked. Sidhu told M that the temple garden had been founded by Rani Rasmani. He said that God was worshipped there daily as Kali, as Krishna, and Shiva, and that within the gates many sadhus and beggars were fed. When they reached Sri Ramakrishna's door again, they found it shut, and Brindhi, the maid, standing outside. M, who had been trained in English manners and would not enter a room without permission, asked her, is the holy man in? Brindhi replied, yes, he's in the room. M, how long has he lived here? Brindhi, oh, he's been here a long time. M, does he read many books? Oh, books? Oh dear, no. They're all on his tongue. M had just finished his studies in college, and it amazed him to hear that Sri Ramakrishna read no books. It's wonderful to see, he's approaching religion like so many of us do, so many of us did and have and are. How many books does he read? Is he educated? Does he know what he's talking about? That we forget and have forgotten perhaps that religion is not about books and knowledge, but about being, about realization, about bliss and joy. M, well, perhaps it's time for his evening worship, meaning that they should go. May we go into the room? Will you tell him we are anxious to see him? Brindhi, go right in, children. Go in, sit down. Entering the room, they found Sri Ramakrishna alone, seated on the wooden couch. Incense had just been burnt and the doors were shut. As he entered, M, with folded hands, saluted the master. Then, at the master's bidding, he and Sidhu sat on the floor. Sri Ramakrishna asked them, "Where do you live? What is your occupation? Why have you come to Baranagur?" M answered the questions, but he noticed that now and then the master seemed to become absent-minded. Later, he learned that this mood is called bhava, ecstasy. It is like the state of the angler who has been sitting with his rod. The fish comes and swallows the bait, and the float begins to tremble. The angler is on the alert. He grips the rod, watches that float steadily and eagerly. He will not speak to anyone. Such was the state of Sri Ramakrishna's mind. Later, M heard and himself noticed that Sri Ramakrishna would often go into this mood after dusk, sometimes becoming totally unconscious of the outer world. M. Perhaps you want to perform your evening worship. In that case, may we take your leave? Sri Ramakrishna, still in ecstasy. No, evening worship. No, it's not exactly that. After a little conversation, M saluted the master and took his leave. Come again, Sri Ramakrishna said. This wonderful little interchange there. The master's in this beautiful mood. Maybe you have to do something. Maybe you have a thing that you have to do. And Ramakrishna says, no, it's not exactly like that. Why? Because his worship wasn't something that he did. His worship was something that he was. And if God is in your presence, you are in worship. You cannot be in the presence of the divine and not worship. Have that beautiful feeling of wonder and love and safety and peace become overwhelming to you as you sit there just completely absorbed in the presence of divine love. That's worship. That's where he was. The scent of the incense and the bells and the gongs around, they all supported that. But worship was not something that Ramakrishna did. Worship was something Ramakrishna was in the presence of the mother. On his way home, M began to wonder, who is this serene-looking man who's drawing me back to him? Is it possible for a man to be great without being a scholar? How wonderful it is. I should like to see him again. He himself said, come again. I shall go again tomorrow or the day after. M's second visit to Ramakrishna took place on the southeast veranda at 8 o'clock in the morning. The master was about to be shaved, the barber having just arrived. As the cold season still lingered, he had put on a moleskin shawl bordered with red. Seeing M, the master said, so you've come. That's good. Sit down here. He was smiling. He stammered a little when he spoke. Sri Ramakrishna to M. Where do you live? In Calcutta, sir. Where are you staying here? Oh, I'm in Baranagur, at my older sister's house, Ishan Kaviraj's house, Sri Ramakrishna. Oh, at Ishan's. Well, how is Keshav now? He was very ill. Indeed, I have heard so too, but I believe he is well now. Sri Ramakrishna. I made a vow to worship the mother with green coconut and sugar on Keshav's recovery. Sometimes in the early hours of the morning, I would wake up and cry before her, Mother, please make Keshav well again. If Keshav doesn't live, who shall I talk with when I go to Calcutta? And so it was that I resolved to offer her the green coconut and the sugar. Tell me, do you know of a certain Mr. Cook who has come to Calcutta? Is it true that he's giving lectures? Once Keshav took me on a steamer, and this Mr. Cook, too, was in the party. M. Yes, sir, I've heard something like that. But I've never been to his lectures. I don't know much about him. Ramakrishna. Pratap's brother came here. He stayed a few days. He had nothing to do, and he said he wanted to live here. I came to know that he'd left his wife and children with his father-in-law. He has a whole brood of them. Oh, I took him to task. Just fancy. He's the father of so many children. Will people from the neighborhood feed them and bring them up? He isn't even ashamed that someone else is feeding his wife and children, and that they have been left in his father-in-law's house. Oh, I scolded him very hard. I asked him to look for a job. Well, then he was willing to leave here. Are you married? Oh, yes, sir. Ramakrishna with a shudder. Oh, Ramlal, alas, he's married. Like one guilty of a terrible offense, M sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the ground. He thought, is it such a wicked thing to get married? The master continued, have you any children? Very sadly, yes. You at M this time could hear the beating of his own heart. He whispered in a trembling voice, yes, I have children. Very sadly, Ramakrishna said, ah, me. He even has children. Thus rebuked, M sat speechless. His pride had received a blow. After a few minutes, Sri Ramakrishna looked at him kindly and said affectionately, you see, you have certain good signs. I know them by looking at a person's forehead, his eyes, and so on. Tell me now, what kind of person is your wife? Has she spiritual attributes, or is she under the power of avidya? So I feel like something needs to be said here. Because this meeting with Ramakrishna would suggest that marriage is the deal breaker, the horrible thing, and then to have children on top of that. But I really think it's because of what he saw in M. He says that you have certain signs. That means that he could see that M was destined for something, that it was M's role in this life to play some very important spiritual part. And he just thought of the distraction that was going to be a part of that, and the difficulties that M was going to have in trying to accomplish that, to put that together. So you see that he absorbed it, and then he comes back very affectionately and very, very positively and very sweetly and asks about his wife. He wants to know, is she a wife that's going to take you toward the ideal, or is she going to take you away from the ideal? He had already determined that M was of the quality that he would take his wife toward the ideal and not take her down from the ideal. And so he wanted to make sure that the wife also was in that same caliber, that is the way that marriage becomes an advantage, is when the two of you in that love, in that commitment and intimacy to each other, you take on this higher ideal. And you begin to try and see it in each other and to practice it with each other. And you become each other's conscience in a way. You become accountable to one another. And through that kind of gravity, you sort of spin around each other faster toward the ideal. That Ramakrishna very clearly says that, when asked, can a householder realize God? And he said, why not? Why couldn't you realize God? Because you are still that. It's still your nature. It's still who you are. And marriage, if lived spiritually and according to the scriptures, is also a path to the divine. So he asks, so of course Ramakrishna asks about his wife. Is she a good wife? Is she going to take you toward God? Is she not going to take you toward the dark? Well, she's all right. I'm just afraid she's a little ignorant. The master, with evident displeasure. And you are a man of knowledge. M had yet to learn the distinction between knowledge and ignorance. Up to this time, his conception had been that one got knowledge from books and schools, from learning, from arrangement of thoughts in the mind. That's my interjection there, by the way. Later on, he gave up his false conception. He was taught that to know God is knowledge, and not to know him ignorance. When Sri Ramakrishna exclaimed, "And you, a man of knowledge?" M's ego was again badly shocked. This knowledge, this point that religion is not about book learning, it's not a philosophy, it cannot happen in the realm of thought. It has nothing to do with your mind. That's why it's so important to understand that your nature is not mind, your nature is not body. Your nature is spirit, which is the container of both the other. And knowing that this knowledge is not something you're going to learn, it's something that you're going to realize. It is sitting in you now, already. It is not going to be built, it's not going to be polished, it's not going to be rearranged. It's just there, waiting for you to leave the mind long enough to come to know it, to leave the body long enough to come to know it. Master, well, do you believe in God with form or without form? M's rather surprised and thinks to himself, how can one believe in God with form when one believes in God? How can one believe in God without form when one believes in God with form? And if he believes in God without form, how can one believe that God has a form? Can these two contradictory ideas be true at the same time? Can a white liquid like milk be black? M. Sir, I like to think of God as formless. Master. Ah, very good. It is enough to have faith in either aspect. You believe in God without form, that is quite all right. But never for a moment think that this alone is true and all else is false. Remember that God with form is just as true as God without form, but hold fast to your own conviction. You see, this is the important thing in understanding the universality of religion, of understanding the presence of God in all of the avatars and in all of the religions of the world. It's still important for us to hold to our own. In this new age that we live in, where we have an internet that's full of all the world's scriptures and thousands, millions of hours probably of spiritual teachers of every ilk, color, size, and shape coming across, we have to understand that we have to have a grounding. We have to choose our tools. We have to choose our path. And we have to become dedicated to that path, and we have to deepen our roots in that path. And what Ramakrishna here is saying is that as you deepen your roots, you can appreciate and be nourished by all the others. You don't have to be afraid of any of them, but stay true to your conviction. Don't go running around digging small holes everywhere. We all know that example, that in order to dig a well and hit water, you have to dig in one place until you hit water. If you dig 3 feet here and get discouraged, can't find any water, you go down the hall to another teacher and you dig 3 feet for a while there. Nothing there. So you try a different church. Oh, no, it's not quite satisfying. So then you go try the Buddhists. Oh, no. And then you go try there's better food over at the Jewish temple. And we go around and we get the sense of growing and doing something because we're learning little bits of everything and we're around spiritual people and we're doing spiritual things. But you're not doing the ripening that's necessary. You're not doing the things that are difficult to do. Because one of the things that's key is that when you're running around to all these different places, it's ego that is running your spiritual life, determining what you like and what you don't like, what practices you're going to do, what practices you're not going to do, what kind of food you like and not like. It's going to be a matter of ego, and it's going to guide you through your spiritual life. And it definitely is not going to work out its own annihilation. This is the reason it's so important for you to be dedicated to a path and to get a teacher. Now, the path for a while can play the role of the teacher, But what is that guru? That guru is somebody or something outside of your ego world, who gives you your teachings and gives you your practices, even though they might not be something you want to do or that you enjoy doing or at that time even like doing. but it is very important that you subject yourself to something greater than your ego. Otherwise, you will never be anything but a servant of your ego. And you won't be able to get anywhere very far in spiritual life. And the worst part of it is the amount of bliss that you miss. the amount of wonder that's available to not be able to taste that, to see that in this life, to think that, at this point in your life, to think that you've experienced everything there is to experience, to think you've been as happy as you can be and as sad as you can be at any given time at this life already, is a great delusion. There's a 10 on this scale that is so far beyond the 10 that we think we've experienced that it's it's mind rupturing indeed. And so that's the reason that we find a teacher. That's the reason that we settle on a path. That's why we dedicate ourselves to a set of principles and to an ideology, and use the scaffolding within that tradition to transcend all traditions. That's the goal. So I know this is always kind of assumed, but I just want to make sure people know you can speak up anytime or ask a question or make a point or elucidate something. So feel free. It's just that this is such a rich text. I prefer just to read more than too much expounding on it. But please dive in and dig in. So he says that he likes to think of God as formless, and Thakur says that's fine. Just don't think everybody else is wrong. And then M is kind of tripping out, like, well, how can two contradictory things be right? How is this possible? So really what's happening here is M's being freed from a little bit of fanaticism, in thinking that we're right. That's a quality of ego, to go around thinking that you're right or that you've got the truth and somebody else does not. That's division, and only the ego divides. The assertion that both God with form and God without form are equally true amazed M. He had never learned this from books. Thus his ego received a third blow. But since it was not yet completely crushed, he came forward to argue with the master a little more. Now, this shows you that M has not yet figured out who Ramakrishna is, right? Because we know later on in the gospel, the only thing M would do consistently from the master, in front of the master, is bow down and take the dust of his feet, just overwhelmed with this man, with this God man. But here we see that that hasn't quite happened yet. So he's arguing with him, which I love to put that into our modern context. We look into Ramakrishna as God himself and we think, oh my God, you've chosen to argue with God directly like that. That's really something. So M says, sir, suppose one does believe in God with form. And certainly he's not the clay image, the master. But why clay? It is an image of spirit. Now, this is an important point. This is a beautiful mark right here that goes on to become a fundamental point. That, it's an image of spirit. What does that mean? You can take that very deep with this understanding that the whole world is mind. It's not material. It's a projection, a reflection of the self on the mind. And so, see, Thakur is teaching him to see it that way. Don't see this thing as material. Don't name it as a form, as clay. Understand that things here are not as they seem, that this is a spirit. It's made of spirit, and spirit you look through. Now, why do I say that? Because Vivekananda says something very important. He says, when you worship an image, do not stop at the image. He says, if you stop at the image and worship the image as the image, that's karma inducing. He says, that's how you get to Ramakrishna Loka, or a Krishna loka or heaven, Christian heaven or whatever, is to look at the image and stay with the image. He says, but if you worship through the image, you look through that image to the divine behind it, to the divine that makes it worthy of looking through. By looking through it, he says that that doesn't create karma, and that leads to moksha, that leads to liberation. So a very interesting distinction being made here. And the image, the clay image, at a certain point, it's not just the images that are images of spirit, but in time we see everything as images in spirit. That's why Vivekananda, when Ramakrishna gave him that experience of non-duality, as he was coming down, he was back in his body, he was walking along the streets in Calcutta, literally banging his head on the iron railing to try and convince him that the world was real, to try and convince him that these things were actually there. And so you see how extreme this teaching, how far this teaching can take you, to the point where you begin to understand this world is not real in and of itself, that there is something inexplicable beyond, that it's a symbol for, that it's a reflection of, and that we can come to experience that primarily before we experience it as a world of form, as of name and form. And that's the point when we begin to see the divine everywhere. We begin to understand, yes, indeed, that everything is one without a substance.
Maharaj,
Yes.
can you please explain the worship of the image and not the image, but the spirit one more time? Because we worship images all the time, like even Sri Ramakrishna and Sharda Devi, everybody, we worship them as a personality, as an image.
Mm-hmm.
I have not gotten to the point of seeing them just as a spirit. So that is producing karma. Doesn't that develop love for them? And doesn't that love get us through the karma?
Yes.
Just a question. I do not know. I do not understand that.
No. Yeah. Don't be afraid. You're absolutely right. And it all be in the beginning, it's just an idea, but it's a placeholder. When you look at the image, just become aware that what you see there is just a tiny subset of what you're actually looking at. So you look at that image, you see Krishna, or you see Thakur, or whatever image you're using, you see that, and you know the love that you feel for it. You know the stories you've heard from it. But then you have to know that there's an eternal presence there that's bigger than the image, that image is symbolizing something in a way that you can manage. But what it's actually going to give you, what you're actually going to come to know through that worship, is that is the immanence of that experience, the presence of that experience, that image will no longer take you to a place and time that you've read about, but it will fill your current moment with an infinite wonder, an infinite mercy, an infinite grace. And so it becomes bigger than an image could ever be. It has an impact bigger than what an image could ever have, because it becomes immanent. As long as it remains a statue of Krishna that has a place in history, and it has a leela and a story around it. But you look at that image and you enjoy that story, and you love that place in history, and you love the things that you learn and are inspired by from it. But by looking through it, by looking through that image, you understand that it's a window, and that all the things that you're feeling are just the stained glass on a window. But the light, the sun behind that window, unbelievable in its immensity, unbelievable in its power, unbelievable in its size. And so you look at that image and understand this is just a beautiful colored window through which the divine, which is infinitely more, is shining, right? And so this happens over time, little by little. He's just telling you, always know that it's true. Even if you don't see it right now, fine, no problems. Because yes, Mother is opening the doors in their right time, for us. We will all see this as we grow. But he's just saying, even now, allow yourself to imagine how big this really is. Even now, allow yourself to imagine that this can't be restricted to a temple, that this is going to become your very experience of being at some point, that this is going to become everything to you at some point in a way that an image simply could not. Because an image, you can leave the room and then you're away from the image. Understanding that you're looking through the image at the sun, you walk out of that room into the sun, and you understand the implication of the image everywhere. That everything is an image of God. But yes, you're right. But I mean, look, even the karma that you get is good karma. It's karma that it's vidya. It's moving you toward the goal. It's not avidya. It's not bad karma that's taking you away from the goal. So it's taking you there. It's just knowing, when you know it's time to let go, don't be afraid to let go. When you know it's time, to stop these other practices, when your hair's standing on end on your arm and the back of your neck at the name of God, then that you can let go of those forms of worship. You don't need to stay. You don't need to cling to them and feel like they are something, that they are the thing giving it to you. They are not. They're reflecting the thing in you. Does that help at all?
Thank you, Maharaj. Yes, it does.
Okay.
I don't see it happening anytime soon, but thank you.
Don't say that. Oh my goodness, it might happen this very night. Very truly, it might happen this very night. You never know these things. Yeah. Be careful. Not because those things are wrong to say things like that, because that's as we see it in the moment. But understand that our mind writes our story, right? Yeah. And if you say things like that, then they have to be true, right? And you subject yourself to a karma, to a story, and you don't have to, at all. You don't have to have even one more day of the suffering of non-realization. Mother says, this very moment you can have your realization. It's yours if you want it. And so we definitely want it. So we should always speak positively. We should always think it's quite possible, because I remember, this is just a personal story. Forgive me. Well, you can't forgive me for that. I've said so many of them anyway. I'm just hearing other swamis tell me that I give too many personal stories. But my personal story was that, after I met Moksha Prana and I was doing my practice, that first year, I was very naive. Very, very naive. I mean, so naive that I was on that trip in India with my friend Philip, and we had already seen Moksha Prana. I had already taken initiation. I was doing my practice, and I was sitting at a table in a restaurant called Chotiwala in Rishikesh. And, I just felt a little something. It was nothing. It was just some little emotional twinge or something inside. And I put both my hands on the table and I looked at Philip, and I was very serious. I looked at him and I said, Philip, I think it's happening. And he looked at me kind of puzzled. He says, what's happening? And I said, I think I'm realizing God. And, I fully meant it. I fully meant it. And he had the kindness not to bust out laughing at me, But I remember when I sat one time in meditation when I was in Mayavati, on that just a few days later from this story. I was sitting in meditation, and I had already been meditating for quite some time, more than an hour, maybe more than 2 hours. And I looked at my watch, and I knew that I'd been sitting there for quite some time, but I didn't want to get up because I thought it could happen. I thought if I just stay here, maybe just a few more minutes, this could happen. And I had that kind of attitude, and I was able to hold on to that for about a year, or so of my first year or so, where I just had this sense of wonder every time I sat down at the possibility of knowing God, the possibility of seeing these divine truths, because you certainly, it wasn't out of nowhere that I got that information. I mean, I'm reading the gospel at that time, and people are popping into realization left and right in this book, going into ecstasies and, dancing in pavas and just losing it, walls whirling away and light and oceans. I mean, it's everywhere in here. Every other page, Tonkor is checking out, going home for a few minutes before he comes back down. And so I was assuming this was the normal, that this was reality. This is the way. And you know what? I still maintain that it is. I'm sorry that the world has kind of crushed a little bit of my naivete and that I can't quite muster that sense of excitement at this point. But not sorry that I've stuck with it for 20 something years, because the gentleness of what I have now is probably worth much more than any of the excitement that I could have had at that time. But just be careful, be sure to say and bring yourself to the story that you want, that this is your last life, that you don't have to come back again unless you want to, and that you can realize God now if you want to. And so it's more about weeding out those parts of you that don't want to through discrimination, through discernment. Get in there and find out, why don't you want it? Why are you holding on? What are you holding on to? And get rid of it as fast as you possibly can and go forward. But always maintain at least the idea that tonight could be the night. This meditation could be your last. This could be the one that doesn't end. And hold to that. One, because it's true. And two, because it makes spiritual life so much more beautiful. So much more beautiful. So identify with success, not with failure.
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you.
Yes. All right. We'll read a little bit more here. But why clay? The master says. It's an image of spirit. M could not quite understand the significance of this image of spirit. So Kamala, you're in good company. M is also like, what are you talking about? But sir, he said to the master, one should explain to those who worship the clay image that it's not God, and that while worshiping it, they should have God in view and not the clay image. One should not worship clay. The master, sharply. That's the one hobby of you Calcutta people. Giving lectures and bringing others to the light, and nobody ever stops to consider how to get to the light himself. Who are you to teach others? He who is the Lord of the universe will teach everyone. He alone teaches us, who has created this universe, who has made the sun, who has made the moon, men, beasts, and everything else, who has provided means for their sustenance, who has given children parents and endowed them with love to bring them up. The Lord has done so many things. Will he not show people the way to worship him? If they need teaching, then he will be the teacher. He is our inner guide. Another beautiful door around fanaticism. We are not teachers. We're cheerleaders for each other. We lift each other up. We encourage each other. We hope deeply for each other's success. We encourage and just give everybody an opportunity to go forward. But we don't impose our view. We don't impose our own understanding. We leave that to the divine. We become conscious of being tools, of being instruments, and Mother may be using us or may not, who knows, but she may be using us. But we do that consciously with the thought, Mother, please, speak to your children, or Mother, please teach this person, or please lift us up, like that. But God is your inner guide. This is how intimately beautiful this is. Thakur telling you, God is teaching you. So the learning you're doing right now, if you're doing any learning, it's not you learning. It's God teaching. That section of Satchitananda, which is your intelligence, which is God, is allowing you to understand, allowing you to see, allowing you to make sense of something that would not make sense without it. So it's a beautiful intimacy, a beautiful dance, this studying and learning. Suppose there is an error in worshiping the clay image. Doesn't God know that? Doesn't God know that through it, he alone is being invoked? He will be pleased with that very worship. Why should you get a headache over it? You had better try for knowledge and devotion yourself. So you see, our religion is our own. It's our own. And we create a beautiful temple. And Mother may use that to inspire somebody. She may use that to love somebody. She may use that to serve somebody. But we should not walk around determining how we're going to use it and how we're going to teach with it. We always step out of the way and give deference, knowing that Mother has everybody on a path, has them exactly where she wants them on that path, and that she alone is responsible for moving them forward on that path. And if we can muster that kind of respect for each other, if we can muster that sort of trust in the divine in each other, how much better, how much sweeter would life be? This time, M felt that his ego was completely crushed. He now said to himself, yes, he's spoken the truth. What need is there for me to teach others? Have I known God? Do I really love him? I haven't room enough for myself in my bed, and I'm inviting my friend to share it with me. I know nothing about God, yet I am trying to teach others. What a shame. How foolish I am. This is not mathematics or history or literature that one can teach it to others. No, this is the deep mystery of God. What he says really appeals to me. So there it is. We'll pause there until next week. But it's such a magical thing to walk into the presence of Thakur. I love when you walk into the room. That's one of the big benefits of going and visiting Dakshineshwar, is just to see the layout and see the building, see it the way it is. And then when you come and read about it, you can just imagine, Thakur sitting there alone in the room, chanting the name of God, sitting on a wooden couch, and he sees you come in. Oh, come in, have a seat, sit down. And you imagine going in and sitting, and you just can't even imagine. Imagine going into a room where God is. Imagine, even some of our great swamis are able to produce a beautiful, calm and meditative atmosphere around them when you see them. Imagine what it is to walk in on an incarnation. Imagine what that must be like, just to walk in to God herself, chanting, just being, fully present, already knowing everything about you, already knowing your story, inviting you to sit down on the floor, already intimate. He just looks at you and you see every grandmother, every grandfather loving you through those eyes. You just see such a sweetness, such a kindness. And to sit in that stunning silence of inner peace that exudes from these great souls. Just to sit locked in this gaze at freedom, imagine. It's like a prisoner looking out the window of his cell, like, wow, how beautiful, how big, how enormous. So, Priya, what do you think?
I don't know. I'm just loving it. That's all.
Nice.
Kind of speechless for the moment. Doesn't happen
I
often.
love, yeah, right.
Yeah.
I love the way you're reading it, Swami. It's
Mhm.
really quite beautiful. It really brings it to life for me.
Yeah.
I think that's what, yeah.
Yeah. No, it is alive. It is alive.
Really is.
It's happening now. As we read it, it happens.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, very
Yeah,
good.
he read that one time in Hollywood, and I was telling him it's just everything was just it was seeming like everything was coming alive. Every people
Mhm.
we were in the room witnessing everything. Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank
Yes,
you,
yes.
Swami.
Beautiful.
I
beautiful.
feel the same. I thank me, but I'm feeling the same. It's like you read these things. That's the beauty of the gospel is it's alive, living. All
Mhm.
scripture is that way, but for our
Mhm.
heart, the gospel is special. It just it really just happened. It's since the whole world happens in your mind, then as you read something like this, you watch it happen in your mind. How is that any different?
Mhm.
It's not different. It's the same,
Mhm.
especially scripture. So, all right. Well, we'll pick up
Thank
again
you.
next
Thank you,
week.
Maharaj.
Thank you so much, Swami.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Swami.
Jai Ma.
Jai
Jai
Ma.
Ma.
Same.